Okay, I want to welcome you both to class and welcome anyone who's listening to the archive later on. This is our first class of aesthetics and theory of communication. And we were just talking a little bit about Photoshop. And so tonight I'm going to give you an introduction of what to expect for the class and what this is all about. Photoshop does play a part. It's not a big part. The class really focuses more on theory as far as the aesthetics principles, things like color theory and some design composition fundamentals that would definitely be helpful in a graphic design context, but are more general to any kind of visual media. But anyway, that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. And I should say I'm working at my home office today, so if you hear odd noises in the background, it's probably my cats. They like to make guest appearances occasionally. So, this course is about aesthetics. And when you hear that term aesthetics, what comes to mind? What does that mean to you, or how would you define that? Okay, so it's totally new to some people. That is, it's something that certainly is not something that many of us have really explored in depth. You may hear the term aesthetics thrown around very casually to refer to a specific style or look, or maybe more often used in sentences like saying something is aesthetically pleasing, usually meaning it's very attractive. And Allison said how we perceive art and how things fit together. And yeah, it actually originates from a branch of philosophy which dealt with art for the most part, but really about what makes things beautiful, what what would constitute beauty in different contexts. And you can see that there's some subjectivity to that. Both of the paintings that I have on the screen right now are considered classic works of art. One is a Jackson Pollock painting in the upper left and a Monet painting in the lower right. Very different styles, but both are appreciated in different art circles. And so obviously there's some individual preferences and individual tastes involved. Since we're dealing with the modern media world and we're focused on um, becoming media professionals um, whose task is to achieve a specific goal with our media. You think about modern day in the modern media world, if you're a journalist, your job is to convey the story. If you are a marketer or an advertiser, your goal is to sell your product as the best you can. Um, so while studying the philosophy of art and beauty could be valuable, we need something more concrete, more of sort of the scientific working definition that we can directly apply. And that is where the more current definition, which is applied media aesthetics, comes into play. Now, let me go back a step if I can. Now, looking at this definition that's on the screen, it says aesthetics in art philosophy is the study of sensory and emotive values for the purpose of appreciating and creating beauty. And then if we look at the definition for applied media aesthetics is a little different. It's a process in which we examine a number of media elements, how they interact, and our perceptual reactions to them. What is the key difference between those definitions? Sure. And the underlining there is a bit of a hint. It's, well, a giveaway, but okay, let me see. Okay, and Allison said the art philosophy focuses more on the sensory and emotional values, whereas applied media aesthetics is more of the interaction and the reaction. And yeah, you're definitely on the right track with that. And what you see is, in addition, and I think the word reaction is really the important point there, because looking at the philosophy of art, it's about the sensory and emotive values related to beauty, specifically to beauty. And you don't really see the word beauty appearing anymore. You see perceptual reactions, and beauty, appreciating something's beauty, is a perceptual reaction, but it's only one of a wide spectrum of possible perceptual reactions. So now we're not just focused on that, we're focused on any reaction our audience might have and how we can evoke a specific reaction through the media that we use, the elements that we combine. And just to give a little more definition, when I say media elements, I'm referring to the component parts like the imagery, the color, the sound, if it's a multimedia experience. That can include recorded voices as well as soundtracks and music, as well as any kind of motion that takes place if it's more of a rich media experience like video. We'll be dealing mostly with two-dimensional media like print ads this month, but what we're going to be talking about this month really applies across the board to any kind of visual medium. So especially in this first week, but throughout the course, you'll see that we are looking at how each of these different elements can help support a given perceptual reaction or inspiring a perceptual reaction from our viewers. On the next few slides, I'm going to show a series of ads. These are taken from the We Love Ad website that you are familiar with now. Some of these might look familiar, in fact. But what I want you to do as I flash each one of these on the screen is tell me two things. First, what your initial reaction is. How does it make you feel? And then second, what is it trying to communicate? So that's really two related things, but different things. The message that that the designer is trying to communicate is more of the intellectual aspect, whereas the impression, the feeling you have is more emotional. It's more kind of that gut feeling. So let's take a look at some of these. Here's our first one. Okay, and Hannah's response was pretty quick, and it was, "Oh my goodness," and she would freak out. Yeah, it's comical, and it'll make you laugh. That scene, especially like the very satisfied look of accomplishment on the baby's face. So that's your emotional reaction with the comical side. And what's the message? And it's telling you that these wipes can clean up any mess, no matter how messy. Yeah, and it's really getting that idea across using comedy. So you see how that emotional response helps to support and convey that more practical message. And the baby is completely clean. I assume that the dad just finished wiping the baby down, whereas the rest of the room is entirely just a disaster. That baby must have had a big old plate of spaghetti. And next one up, I think this one probably is familiar. It was from the exploration activity. I don't remember whose, but somebody posted this one. Okay, it was Hannah. And when you saw it, you got excited. Okay, so the men are good looking, but the purse is gorgeous, and that's where your visceral reaction came from. Allison, you said you were confused at first. Where did that feeling come from? Okay, so just trying to decipher the message really didn't wasn't clear at first. I never actually read the small print down here, but yeah, that's all all around just very suggestive. Okay, yeah, and it's man crafted, and I think if we were to apply any kind of practical message to this, it would simply be about the quality of workmanship of these purses, the quality of the product. But I don't think that's the real force behind the design of this ad. Okay, this next one's a little more emotionally charged. We'll give that warning. Yeah, that definitely looks like there's some abuse taking place. And your initial impression is to want to help. Allison, what was I can't remember now what your reflective level one was. What was that one about? Welcome, Jasmine. And one thing that's really important with this ad is oh yes, I'm sorry, just responding to Allison's comment, the one about addiction and the one about the reasonable weight. That one was very powerful, and actually you'll see that one pop up a little later in the slideshow. But yeah, this one really leverages that expression, that face, that feeling that we see reflected in that child's uh, the hurt and sadness in that face, and the hands being very symbolic. If you look, it's not actually a solid hand, but made up of words that are very hurtful names and put downs. And the message, and it's kind of spelled out in the small print, is to help juvenile protective associations stop all child abuse. So really emphasizing how abuse is not just physical, but can be emotional through words as well. So yeah, definitely can strike a very deep emotional connection. And one last one. Actually, no, it's not the last one. So this one makes you want a new car. Um, what do you feel about the message of the ad? What is it trying to say about this particular car? There's too much red. There is a lot of red, and that's an important factor. We'll talk more about that in week 2 when we deal with color theory and color psychology. Yeah, red is a big part of what makes this ad what it is. So this is an ad that for a car, and car ads are fun because they take a lot of different approaches. Once we look at the levels of emotional design, you can find car ads that exemplify each of them. But yeah, that the flame of desire connects really well with the red color. And petrol is gas. It's I believe what they refer to gas as in the UK. So this is probably a European ad. But you see how, in this case, the emphasis is not necessarily on any particular aspect of the car, its engine or its performance or so forth, but really just that flame of desire, emphasizing the red kind of sporty look of the car. I'm going to skip the next one because it's kind of boring. And I just saw, Hannah, I just saw your comment about not really understanding what they were trying to get across. I think the one drop of petrol is kind of a message about fuel efficiency, perhaps, but the flame of desire is sort of a message about how you fall in love with the vehicle. Perhaps it's definitely ties in with that idea of passion and desire that that red often signifies. So I wanted to show those quick ads up front just to show the connection that we will have between the emotion that can be conveyed through imagery and through a combination of imagery and words, and the message or the purpose and goals of a piece of media, in particular advertising. I use advertising a lot in this course, not because I want this to be an advertising course, but because advertising gives really wonderful examples of all of the different principles, especially with dealing with emotional design, because they make use of emotion, try to make emotional connections to get their message and their goal across. And the goal with advertising, of course, is to sell that product. And if you can make an emotional connection with your viewer, then the more likely they will react in a desirable way. So if you have done the readings from this week's content focus, you'll recall that in the Aesthetics for Dummies chapter, they talk about 3 layers of aesthetics. And one of those is associations. And they define that as what this means to the viewer. So besides the simple fact of what is being shown in the imagery or what's being said, we all have our individual experiences, and we all have preferences and our own individual needs, and so we'll react to things differently. And that's what that associations layer of aesthetics is all about. How do you make this meaningful to a viewer, an audience? And it's tough simply because we are all individuals and we are all unique. And tailoring any kind of media to address the individual is pretty near impossible. Although if you look at some of the targeted ads on Facebook and so forth, you see that they're really trying, just based on your own online behavior and tracking that behavior. But for the most part, it is less practical to focus on the individual and try to predict the individual reactions, but instead to look at general trends and things that will evoke a response in the audience as a whole. And this is where knowing your audience comes in really valuable, because if you know that you are talking to a specific demographic, then you can more easily predict how they'll react to things. But what I've provided in the class, though, is a framework, which is emotional design, which makes this a little bit more manageable. And Hannah, you're saying when you looked at the ads, you saw more visceral and behavioral designs than reflective. But in the reading, it says that reflective design is a bit more difficult to evoke in the user or the viewer because you don't know what they're. Yes, and that's precisely correct. And I'm not surprised that you saw more visceral and behavioral. And if you think about the reasons, in addition to reflective design being just more difficult, we're looking at advertising. So the behavioral level is pretty much a given. They're putting forth a product or a service or some other message and trying to convince you that it is of benefit to you. So that's that behavioral level, which I'll explore in more detail in a second. But and then the visceral level is our instincts. It's something that we react to, especially sex appeal. and which is pretty widespread in media, in advertising especially, but even in TV and movies. Yes, lots. That is probably one of the most frequently used approaches to, especially at the visceral level. So I'm not surprised that you saw a lot of visceral and behavioral uh, designs, and probably a lot of combinations of the two. Whereas reflective is more difficult, because that's where you have to really know what matters to your audience, and what some of their experiences are. Um, so really tough. Just to get into a little bit of what we're talking about, emotional design was defined by an author named, what is his name? It's escaping. Oh, there it is. Donald Norman. There you go. He originally became known from a book called The Design of Everyday Things, which was more of a a practical look at physical products and how some things can be more user-friendly, and so forth. And then he turned to emotional design, which is why we react favorably or negatively to everyday things. So he was still focused on physical products. He especially talks a lot about tea kettles, just because I think he collects tea kettles, but that was an example he used often. So I took his ideas, and I'm not obviously not the first to do this, and translated that to media. So not physical products, but now looking at media design, whether it's web design or video or ad design. And the other reading was about web design using these ideas. So he defined these three levels: visceral, behavioral, and reflective, to define the levels of emotion. And we can use this to guide us as we plan our media creations, and decide, okay, how do we want to appeal to our audience? Do we want to go for more of a kind of tugging at the heartstrings, reflective level, high level emotion with sentimentality? Do we just want to emphasize something practical? Or do we want to kind of take the low road and go with these very base instinctive drives at the visceral level? So yeah, the visceral level is our gut instincts. These are things that drive us on a what they call a pre-conscious level. So it's not something we have to think about. We just see something and it evokes a reaction, an immediate gut reaction. In fact, visceral comes from viscera, which is literally our guts, our insides. Behavioral is learned, and that's, if you're familiar with behavioral psychology, that's a psychology of learning, that we behave in a way based on our experiences. And so this deals with things we've learned to react to, or learned to appreciate, or on the opposite side of that, learned to fear or to dislike. And in advertising, at least, as we've seen, it focuses on practical needs and usefulness and immediate benefits. So it's more short-term, as opposed to reflective, which can be much more long-term and look at big picture topics. And the reflective design is conscious. This is that frontal lobe that makes us uniquely human, that we're able to put rational thought into things and interpret things. So we see something and it makes us think. It gives us an emotional reaction, but instead of having this immediate gut response, we interpret that, we think about it. And so maybe it uses symbolism and some deeper messages that we have to consider and interpret, or maybe problem solve. So let's look at a few examples of each of these. And these are a couple of creatures I know, at least in my experience with friends, that can evoke some pretty strong visceral reactions, especially spiders. And snakes. There was an article I read not too long ago where they had done a study. It was a psychology study that where they found that people would have a reaction, like a fight or flight reaction, to a snake in their environment, even before they were consciously aware that the snake was there. So, so basically, what that showed was that their senses were picking up the snake. There's a snake over there, but it didn't quite get to the frontal lobe, our conscious mind, before their body started reacting. And that's really exemplifies the visceral level. It's that kind of instinctive, unconscious response. And spiders, while I haven't seen a similar study for spiders, I know from interacting with a lot of my friends that spiders can evoke that kind of response pretty quickly too. And so what this ad campaign has done is associated that fear of those dangerous animals, the poisonous spider and cobra, with the danger of electrical shock with those electrical outlets. Another example, and tell me what you see when you look at this image. What comes to mind? Mean and shocked is what Allison says. And there you go. So you see on the left side, there are the dark gray electrical sockets, and they look angry. And then the ones on the right look surprised or shocked, or I always say afraid or fearful. And isn't it interesting that your first impression on seeing this inanimate object is to attribute emotions to it? We know that our electrical sockets aren't really feeling emotions. They don't generally get angry at us or feel shocked by our behavior, or maybe that the ones on the right are shocked by the anger of the ones on the left. But yeah, we know that's really not there. That's something that our brains are creating. It's applying meaning to what we're seeing, and that's something our brains are inclined to do. And it's actually a visceral level component, is our natural instinct to look for meaning. And especially when that meaning is surprise on a face, a recognizable face, which we look at this and we see a recognizable face. So by extension of that, when we're shown a face exhibiting strong emotion, we internalize that. We have a sense of empathy, and so we can reflect that feeling back. In fact, they call this mirror neurons in neurology. These are something that's wired in our brain to look for those expressions of emotion and to mirror them. And you see that especially with a baby. A newborn baby learns their expressions from adults. They mimic adults that they interact with. And that tendency is innate, and it doesn't really go away as we grow to adulthood. We just hopefully stop imitating the facial expressions of everyone around us, but never lose the ability to interpret and reflect that. And that's what we call empathy. It's just our nature as social creatures. How that applies in media is that if you want your audience to feel an emotion, then show them expressions of that emotion, whether it's excitement and fun, or sentimentality, or grief and sadness. The fun thing about this is that it doesn't have to be a photograph of an actual person. It's any recognizable face. So you can show the sad faces of dogs in the pound on a Sarah McLachlan commercial and evoke that kind of feeling in your audience, because we apply those emotions to the faces of those animals. Or it can be a cartoon character just as well. Anything that is a recognizable eyes, nose, and mouth. A very strong visceral level component. And we'll see that quite a bit. In fact, in this week's analysis activity, this plays a part. And that's a bit of a hint right there. And the one we talked about already, which is that of sex appeal. And there's that old adage that sex sells, and that has been true since the beginning of advertising. In this particular very suggestive ad, this is actually someone's feet. Those are the heels of I assume, a woman's feet, but arranged in a way so as to be very, very suggestive. And the little tiny print down there, they always make this print so tiny. It says "Sexy Heels" by Samantha, and then you see the actual product, which is not very emphasized, which is a moisturizer. And the one we've already seen earlier in the presentation, and yeah, very much a visceral level design. Everything you see here, even if you read some of this, the copy on the screen, the strong sinewy hands cutting, caressing, whipping the real leather apart, and it goes on, and it sounds like a romance novel, basically. And this, again, I think that our natural sense of empathy, as well as sex appeal, are probably the two most common aspects of the visceral level that you'll see. But it also includes just general sensory excitement, anything that's really impactful sensory experience will fall at this level. So this really absurd vision of a man riding a cheetah, riding a rocket, you can evoke a visceral reaction just from the pure physical excitement being depicted, as well as the absurdity of the image. Are there any thoughts or questions about that visceral level and how that applies to media design? And always, as I'm talking, feel free to jump in and add any thoughts you have on any of these. So now at the behavioral level, you see a very different presentation. What do you notice that's very different about the way these this particular ad is being presented? And in particular, focus on the imagery that's being used and the message that's being conveyed. It's a very different approach than what we were seeing in the earlier examples. So while there's still this attractive model on the screen, she's not the focus of our attention necessarily, and she's pretty well covered in this heavy jacket and sunglasses. Instead, the focus is on this phone and the features that it offers. So it's a completely different approach from an emotional standpoint and an intellectual standpoint. No longer going for that very base level emotion, but appealing to our minds and what we come to value and appreciate. And probably the most textbook example of the behavioral level. It'll make your job easier, so immediately focusing on practical benefit. And the only imagery on the screen is the actual product, the tool that they're talking about. And then compare this one to the Passion of Desire ad we saw earlier. Still a car ad, no longer talking about flames of desire and no longer using that color red everywhere you look. But instead, the focus is on how practical this car is. Look how spacious it is, and she's able to load all of her cargo into the hatchback. So, and the colors are more muted, so it's not going for any kind of physical thrills or focus on the physical beauty, but simply on practicality. Which is not to say that you can't make use of very clever imagery in the behavioral level, because you certainly can. And I think there were examples of that in the exploration as well. And this is one where you see the use of a pattern to make the one hand stand out, and so we assume that that's the person that's using this soap to degrease their hands, and then there's a little hint of a visceral level component where it says all the guys at the garage wonder why Hank gets the girl. And some more absurd kind of humorous visual metaphors as well. And the message is all about the capacity of this hard drive, with the visual metaphor of the giant stand-up bass as the amount of music that it can hold, or the number of movies that it can store with the giant popcorn. Another feature that I like to point out with these ads in particular is the use of color. And this isn't necessarily about the emotional design of these pieces, but sort of a preview for next week. Notice that the focal points are really the only things that are in any kind of color, and how that helps attract your attention. So it's something to keep in mind when we move into week 2 a little later on. Are there any questions or thoughts about the behavioral level of emotion and how that differs or relates to the visceral level? So another aspect that I attribute also to the behavioral level is when you react to something that you're just a fan of. It maybe doesn't have a practical benefit, but it's something you've learned to appreciate. Whether you're a fan of, I think the show Supernatural seems to have a pretty big following with some of my friends, or if it's a particular sport or hobby, like I have a student doing projects on flag football, for example. These are things that are learned and that are appreciated and can have a very strong emotional reaction but aren't quite big picture enough to be considered reflective. And here is our reflective example, and this is fishing with Dad. Nothing happened, and yet everything happened. So very, very sentimental, thinking about meaningful memories with father, and how even though it was a completely uneventful day, that just the time together had was where all the meaning comes from. Nothing really about practical benefit, and nothing particularly exciting about the imagery, but just that message of really higher level emotion and sentimentality. And this one kind of takes a little while to really look at and interpret. If you look at the message in the small type at the lower right, it says, "Find out what's behind the clothing you buy." And trying to make that out, and then it says labor rights, human rights. So it's really a message about child labor. It's kind of a little bit of a haunting image. You can see those eyes behind the woven sweater fabric. So I would say that there's definitely a visceral level component to this as well, since you do have that kind of unsettling feeling. And then once you interpret that message, then you understand the bigger picture implications of what's being said, and not only what's being said, but also the choices that we make in our day-to-day lives. This one is very similar. It takes a little while to really examine and interpret. That's something that's true of visceral level design, is that it often can take time to interpret. You don't just immediately get the message. If you look at a tattoo, it says, "I hit and killed the Browns," and gives the date, followed by the tagline, "The consequences stay with you forever." So equating that permanence with the permanence of a tattoo is something that's never going to go away. So definitely something that it makes you think and really makes you consider. Here's another one from one of your exploration activities. It's all about helping to provide clean water to the world. I don't think it says a particular location, but just to the developing world, I would assume. You can help. And this is, I think this was Allison's, the one about body shaming, and see all the girls taking the pictures of the poor girl who's obviously being very humiliated. So really powerful imagery and really powerful message. One shot is enough is the message there. So those are the three levels of emotion that Donald Norman devised, and kind of a look at how that's applied towards advertising design in particular, and media design in general. One thing I'll say is you probably won't go into an advertising firm and hear them talk about devising a reflective level piece or a visceral or behavioral level piece. This isn't necessarily an industry standard terminology. The point of this is just to emphasize that these are things you need to decide on from the outset of any media design project. Is how do I want to connect with my audience? How am I going to approach this? How do I make it matter and leverage that association layer of aesthetics? Because if you can't make that emotional connection, then your media may very well fall flat. So you might decide, well, we're going to take the approach of leveraging sex appeal and make this a very sexy ad, or make it something that's very sentimental and make people think about their family ties and memories from childhood. Very different approaches that might be taken. So if you were, say, a creative director or an art director or just a project manager in charge of a particular design, you might sit down and brainstorm these ideas up front. This is an advertisement that you'll get to know pretty well because this is going to be your week 2 and week 3 analysis subject. But if you think about, or if we kind of dissect this particular advertisement, and if you look at this, can you tell me what this is even about? What are they advertising here? And also, again, what is the initial emotional impression that you get in looking at this? Yes, and the kid hiding under the stairs does look very scared, and yeah, it does say that the message down here at the bottom says, "We'll find your ideas and we'll make them famous." The 50 call for entries is open, denver50.com, and the shadow is coming down the stairs helps to depict the emotion of fear. So it kind of gives you the object of his fear. This is what he's afraid of. So it's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? If you look at that message, which is, we'll find your ideas and then we'll make them famous. But we see imagery that is very fearful, that looks more like a suspense thriller movie poster, perhaps. And just to let you know, this is an advertisement for what is basically an award ceremony. It is an event called the 50. I don't know a whole lot about it, to be honest. I found this ad on welovead.com and it worked really well for my purposes. But what this is an event hosted by the Denver Ad Club for new ideas in advertising, and it's essentially an awards ceremony. But you don't see that at all in this ad, do you? So you think about, put your mind, your mind in the perspective of the person that designed this, that came up with this concept. When they were deciding what impression they would want to associate with this particular message, you could have taken any number of routes. I always think of the idea of fame, of making something famous. There's that idea of celebrity, of Hollywood, of red carpets and sort of the Grammys and the Oscars and so forth. So they certainly could have taken that approach and used imagery that evokes that feeling of celebrity, but they didn't go that route. Maybe that's too predictable. Maybe it's been done already. So instead they took a very different creative approach that could probably be criticized as good or bad, as maybe missing the concept altogether. But in this case, they did go with that suspense thriller idea. And in keeping with that, added this tagline, "You cannot hide it." So that sounds much more threatening and ominous than "We'll find your ideas and we'll make them famous." And I think it's intended in a very playful way, but it all connects to create this very suspenseful scene. And once they had that decided, they were able to pick the imagery, that the fearful expression on the boy's face, which we know is that visceral level component of fear. It's leveraging our sense of empathy, and then this frightening figure of the shadow coming down the stairs. So whether you call it reflective design or visceral design, the important thing is that as you approach any given media creation, you consider what impression is going to be the most effective for achieving the goals of that project. And then you, with that in mind, pick the elements that are going to go into that, to go into supporting that. Are there any last questions before we wrap things up? Okay, so I have already provided my feedback on your exploration for the week. I always like to do that before the go-to sessions, is to see if there's any trends that I need to comment on. It looked pretty good. For the most part, everybody seemed to be on the right track. So now you're going to go into a more detailed analysis of that, of a media piece. Actually, it's not that ad. It's going to be the Scarecrow video from Chipotle this month, or this week. And I'll also say that there's also the Photoshop component. So you'll see that there's a Photoshop practice activity each week, but nothing really graded associated with that, not until week 4. The techniques that we explore in the Photoshop practices are going to correspond with what we're studying each given week. This week is about typography, so it's a little bit different, but it still focuses on setting a mood based on the look and the style of the fonts. Next week, it will be about changing colors in a photograph, and we'll be talking about color psychology and color theory. So these will be Photoshop techniques that will help you apply the ideas that we're studying from an aesthetic standpoint. And we'll get into photo manipulation in week 3 to go along with composition. Stay on top of those, even though they're not graded, because they are preparing you for a design project that you'll do in week 4 that kind of brings those two parts of the class together. You'll use your Photoshop skills to apply the design concepts that we study through the content focus and lectures. So that is my week 1 presentation. I do appreciate you all bearing with me through it. I know Jasmine was having some technical issues and had to log out. Are there any other questions, not just about the content for the presentation, but the class in general? Okay, well, if anything comes to mind, please feel free to message me on FSO or email me or give me a call, and I'll be happy to work with you. But otherwise, I will talk to you all soon. Some of you I'll probably talk to you tomorrow for the Portfolio Project 1 presentation as well. But otherwise, I wish you a good night.